When I was pressing little Proserova's head, I could feel my fingers sinking into it. I did not feel any skull cracking at that time. I was just pressing the little head, and my fingers got deeper and deeper. My anger faded away after a while, and I could continue working. These were the words of Marie Fikackova, a 24-year-old nurse who stood in a cold interrogation room in Sušice, Czechoslovakia, describing with clinical detachment how she had murdered newborn Bobbies placed in her care. It was February 28, 1960, nearly 6 hours into questioning that would stretch past midnight, and the horror she was confessing would shake an entire nation to its core. But to understand how a nurse became a killer, how healing hands became instruments of death, we must go back to the beginning, to a childhood marked by hatred and dysfunction in a country torn apart by war. Marie Schmidl was born on September 9, 1936, in the small town of Sušice, nestled in the forested hills of western Czechoslovakia, a place where narrow cobblestone streets wound between buildings that had stood for centuries, where the Otava River flowed cold and dark through the valley, and where families lived according to traditions that had remained unchanged for generations. But Marie's family was different. They were Sudeten Germans, ethnic Germans who had lived in the Czech lands for hundreds of years but who maintained their German language, their German customs, and increasingly in the 1930s, their German nationalism. Marie's father was a laborer, a man who earned his living through hard physical work in a region where opportunities were scarce and life was difficult for most people regardless of their ethnicity. But he was also an alcoholic, a violent drunk who filled their home with rage and the stench of cheap liquor, who spoke constantly of his hatred for Czechs, who aligned himself with Nazi ideology as Adolf Hitler's Germany grew in power and influence throughout the decade. When Marie was just 3 years old, World War II began, and the region where she lived became part of the Nazi occupation. The Sudeten Germans, including Marie's father, generally welcomed the German troops, collaborated with the occupation forces, took positions of authority over their Czech neighbors. For nearly 6 years, from 1939 to 1945, the Sudetenland was part of Hitler's empire, and those Germans who lived there were viewed as racially superior to the Slavic Czechs who surrounded them. Marie grew up in this atmosphere, learning that some people were better than others based solely on their ancestry, absorbing her father's vitriol about the Czechs even as she attended school and tried to navigate childhood in a world consumed by war. Her relationship with her mother was no better. They fought constantly, violent arguments that sometimes became physical, a bond between parent and child that should have been loving, but was instead marked by mutual resentment and anger. Then came May 1945 and the end of the war. The Nazis were defeated, Hitler was dead, and Czechoslovakia was liberated by Allied forces. But liberation brought vengeance. The Czech people who had suffered under Nazi occupation for 6 years did not forgive or forget the collaboration of the Sudeten Germans. Across the country, German families were identified, their property seized, their homes taken from them. Marie's family was among those targeted, reported for their German nationality and their collaboration during the war years. They lost everything, their home confiscated, forced to relocate to whatever housing they could find, marked as traitors and enemies in a country that had once been their home. Marie was 9 years old when this happened, old enough to understand that her family was hated, that people spat at them in the streets, that doors closed when they approached. The sense of being despised, of being considered inferior and unworthy, burned itself into her consciousness during these formative years. Despite the chaos and dysfunction of her home life, despite the poverty and social ostracism her family faced, Marie was a good student. She excelled in school, demonstrating intelligence and dedication that suggested a future beyond the limitations of her circumstances. In 1951, at age 15, she enrolled in the secondary health school in Klatovy, a nearby town where she could receive nursing education. This was her escape, her opportunity to build a life separate from her father's drunken rages and her mother's bitter arguments. For 4 years, she studied anatomy, physiology, medical procedures, patient care, all the skills necessary to work in healthcare. She was diligent, thorough, professional in her studies. In 1955, at age 19, Marie Schmidl graduated with her nursing credentials and began looking for work. She found employment at the District Institute of National Health in Soucius, the same town where she had been born, where her family's disgrace was well known. In 1957, she was assigned to the obstetrics department, working with pregnant women and newborn babies in the hospital's maternity ward. Her colleagues found her to be exemplary, a hard-working nurse who showed up for every shift, who followed protocols carefully, who seemed dedicated to her profession. She was even being considered for promotion to head nurse, a position of authority and respect that would represent a remarkable achievement for someone from her background. Around this time, she married Marie Fikackova, a Czech man, taking his surname and becoming Marie Fikackova. It should have been a fresh start, a way to leave behind the stigma of her German heritage. But the marriage was troubled from the beginning. They remained childless despite planning to start a family after the 1960 Spartakiad, the massive gymnastic performances that were a major cultural event in communist Czechoslovakia. They lived with Marie's parents, which meant living with all the old arguments and tensions that had defined her childhood. The marriage would eventually fail, leaving Marie even more isolated and bitter than before. What her colleagues and husband didn't know, what no one suspected during those years from 1957 to 1960, was that Marie Fikackova harbored a dark secret, a rage that built inside her during certain times of the month, a hatred that focused itself on the most innocent and helpless creatures under her care. She hated the sound of crying babies, the high-pitched wails that echoed through the maternity ward, the endless screaming of newborns who could not be soothed, drove her into states of uncontrollable fury. She claimed later that this rage came during her menstrual periods, that hormonal changes triggered something in her brain that transformed irritation into homicidal violence. Whether this was medically accurate or simply the explanation she offered to make sense of her own actions, no one could say with certainty. But what was certain was that when babies cried in her presence, when their screams penetrated her concentration, she felt an overwhelming urge to make them stop by any means necessary. The first documented incident occurred on September 20, 1959. A newborn girl named Jana M. had been crying persistently on the ward, one of those babies who seemed inconsolable, whose screams went on and on despite all efforts to calm her. Marie was working that shift, and as the crying continued, she felt the familiar rage building inside her. She approached the baby's crib, reached down and grabbed the infant's ear. Then she pulled with all her strength, yanking so hard that she tore the ear halfway off the child's head. Blood poured from the wound, soaking the baby's swaddling clothes, pooling in the crib. The injury was too severe to hide or explain away easily, so Marie reported it to the head nurse, claiming it had been an accident. She said she had been lifting the child and had accidentally grabbed the ear along with the swaddling clothes, tearing it in a rushed movement. The head nurse, having no reason to suspect deliberate violence from a nurse who had always seemed professional and competent, accepted this explanation. Such accidents could happen in a busy maternity ward, she said, and she instructed Marie to take the baby for surgery to repair the damage. 2 months later, on November 24, 1959, another incident occurred. Marie was working with a newborn boy named Vaclav P., changing his clothes and performing routine care. The child grabbed at a nearby scale, a reflexive movement of the kind that babies make constantly. But to Marie, already in the grip of one of her rage states, this simple action was intolerable. She jerked the baby with brutal force, twisting his small body with such violence that she broke his humerus, the long bone in his upper arm. She heard the crack, distinct and unmistakable, but she did not report the injury. She simply finished her work and returned the baby to his crib, saying nothing to anyone. The fracture was discovered later, and when Vaclav's mother asked what had happened, The medical staff told her it must have occurred during childbirth and had simply been overlooked. This explanation, though implausible, was accepted because no one imagined that a nurse would deliberately harm an infant. Then came February 1960, the month when Marie Fikackova's secret would finally be exposed. On February 19th, a 1-month-old girl named Hanna Himmelbauer was admitted to the neonatal ward while her mother recovered from childbirth. Marie was on duty, and over the following days, she reported that Hanna was behaving strangely, exhibiting odd symptoms. A doctor was called to examine the child and found injuries that were difficult to explain, but no definitive diagnosis was made. The baby remained in the ward under observation. Then, in the early morning hours of February 23rd, another child in the ward stopped breathing. A doctor was summoned and determined the cause was respiratory failure, something not uncommon in newborns with their fragile, underdeveloped systems. The death was recorded, and preparations were made for the baby's body to be examined. But this time, when the autopsies were performed on both babies who had died, the pathologists found something deeply disturbing. These were not natural deaths. The babies had suffered severe brain injuries, their skulls fractured, one infant's arms broken in multiple places. The patterns of injury were inconsistent with birth trauma or accidental damage. These children had been subjected to deliberate violence, beaten with enough force to crack bone and rupture brain tissue. The hospital authorities immediately suspected foul play and contacted the police. An investigation was launched, focusing on everyone who had access to the babies, everyone who had been working on the ward during the relevant time periods. Marie Fikackova was among those interviewed. She came to the police station on February 27th, 4 days after the deaths, expecting routine questioning. What followed was 6 hours of interrogation that stretched past midnight. Initially, Marie denied any wrongdoing. She was defensive, insisting she had done nothing wrong, that she was a good nurse who cared about her patients. But as the hours dragged on, as the interrogators pressed her with questions about her whereabouts, about her interactions with the babies, about the timing of the injuries and deaths, her resistance began to crumble. Finally, after midnight, in what investigators described as a spontaneous confession, Marie admitted what she had done. She had killed the babies, both of them. She had crushed their skulls with her bare hands, pressing down with her thumbs until she felt the bone give way, until their brains were damaged beyond any possibility of survival. She had broken their arms, twisted their tiny limbs with enough force to snap the delicate bones. And she had done it because they were crying, because the sound drove her into rages she claimed she could not control. But the confession didn't stop there. As the interrogation continued into the morning hours, Marie revealed even more. She admitted to attacking at least 10 other newborns during her time working in the maternity ward. Some had suffered broken bones. Others had been subjected to attempts at suffocation or strangulation. Most, she claimed, had survived these attacks, though whether this was true or whether she simply didn't know the full extent of the damage she had caused remained unclear. She described her methodology with disturbing clarity, explaining how she would wait until she was alone with a crying baby, how she would use the pressure of her thumbs against soft spots in their skulls, how the violence would satisfy something inside her and allow her to continue working as if nothing had happened. She also offered multiple, contradictory motives for her crimes. Sometimes she said it was revenge against Czech children because her family had been mistreated after the war, because Czech men had insulted her about her German heritage. Other times she claimed it was purely the result of pedophobia, an irrational hatred and fear of children that overwhelmed her during her menstrual periods. The investigation that followed was complicated by the realities of medical practice in 1960s Czechoslovakia. The country was in the midst of fighting a polio epidemic that had killed hundreds of children. The last major outbreak had occurred in 1957, the same year Marie began working at the hospital, and infant deaths from infectious diseases were common enough that they often didn't receive the kind of detailed scrutiny that would have revealed suspicious patterns. Additionally, hospital oversight was inadequate, with no specialized department to investigate unexpected infant deaths, no protocols for ensuring that violent injuries were properly documented and reported. Marie's superiors had accepted her explanations for the torn ear and broken arm because they had no reason to suspect a respected nurse of deliberately harming children. Only because she killed 2 bobbies in a single day, only because their bodies were subjected to thorough autopsies with pathologists specifically looking for signs of unnatural death, was the pattern discovered. Police attempted to verify Marie's confession about the additional victims she claimed to have attacked. They went through handwritten medical documents, work schedules, autopsy records, trying to match dates and deaths to times when Marie had been on duty. But proving these historical crimes was nearly impossible. Many infant deaths had been attributed to polio or other infectious diseases. Some bobbies had been noted as having injuries sustained during birth. The documentation was incomplete, and memories were unreliable. In the end, investigators could only definitively prove the 2 murders on February 23, 1960, along with the attacks on Jana, Vaclav, and Hanna that had left those children injured but alive. All the other claimed victims, the other bobbies Marie said she had killed or hurt, remained unverified ghosts in a system that had failed to protect them. The trial of Marie Fikackova began in the fall of 1960. The case was relatively brief from a legal perspective, lasting only months from arrest to verdict. The evidence of the 2 confirmed murders was overwhelming. Autopsies showed cause of death. Marie's confession was detailed and consistent on the core facts, and she was the only person who had been alone with both bobbies during the time frame when the fatal injuries must have occurred. The court ordered psychiatric evaluations to determine her mental state. Multiple doctors examined her, conducting tests and interviews, trying to understand what had driven a nurse to become a killer. Their conclusions were troubling. Marie was found to be legally sane, capable of understanding right from wrong, able to control her actions despite her claims to the contrary. But she was also diagnosed with severe emotional instability, prone to depression, hysteria, and violent outbursts of anger. The doctors determined that she suffered from what they called psychopathy, a personality disorder that made her dangerous to others, particularly to those who were helpless and unable to defend themselves. The motive question remained murky. Marie herself offered multiple explanations that changed depending on when and how she was questioned. Sometimes she emphasized the crying, describing how the sound of Bobby's screaming would trigger uncontrollable rage. She said her anger would build and build until she had to act, had to make the noise stop, and that pressing on their skulls until they died was the only way she could find relief. After the violence, she said, her anger would fade away and she could continue working as if nothing had happened. Other times she spoke about revenge, about how she targeted Czech bobbies because of insults she had received about her German heritage, because her family had lost everything after the war, because she blamed Czech people for her suffering. Some observers noted that she had married a Czech man and worked in a Czech hospital, which seemed to contradict the revenge narrative. Others pointed out that her victims included bobbies who were far too young to have any ethnic identity, who were simply helpless infants in need of care. The court ultimately convicted her of 2 counts of murder and 3 counts of assault. She was sentenced to death on October 6, 1960, less than 8 months after her arrest. Her lawyer filed appeals, arguing that her mental health issues should be considered mitigating factors, that she deserved treatment rather than execution. The appeals were denied. A petition for clemency was submitted, asking that her sentence be commuted to life imprisonment. This too was rejected. The communist government of Czechoslovakia had little tolerance for criminals who targeted children, and the publicity surrounding the case, though carefully controlled by state media, had created public demand for harsh punishment. The hospital itself worked to suppress details about the full extent of Marie's claimed victims, not wanting to be associated with what could have been one of the worst serial murder cases in Czech history. Parents of Bobbies who had died in the hospital during Marie's tenure were told their children had succumbed to postpartum shock or heart failure, official explanations that avoided any mention of murder or medical malpractice. As Marie waited in Pankrock prison in Prague for her execution date, her life collapsed in other ways as well. Some family members and acquaintances refused to maintain contact with her, distancing themselves from her crimes in an effort to avoid being tarred with the same brush. Her husband Lumir decided to move to Havířov, a town on the opposite side of the country, fleeing the publicity and shame of being married to a child killer. Only her mother maintained written correspondence with Marie during her final months, though prison officials noted that the mother seemed not to fully comprehend the nature of what her daughter had done. In one letter, Marie's mother mentioned that people interested in buying their furniture had begun appearing at the house, and that the family had become targets of slander in their community. The letter suggested confusion and denial, an inability to accept that her daughter was a murderer about to be executed by the state. The morning of April 13, 1961, arrived cold and gray in Prague. Marie Fikackova was 24 years old, still young by any measure, but she had been sentenced to die. Pankrock Prison, a massive fortress-like structure that had held political prisoners, common criminals, and condemned murderers since the 19th century, would be the site of her execution. Czechoslovakia used the short drop method of hanging, a technique that was neither quick nor particularly humane. Unlike the long drop method developed in Britain, which was designed to break the neck instantly and cause rapid death, the short drop method essentially strangled the condemned person, death coming slowly through asphyxiation as the noose tightened around the throat and cut off air supply. Marie would be the first woman executed on the indoor gallows at Pankrock, a tiny trapdoor near the far wall of the execution chamber with a simple halter noose attached to a projecting metal bar overhead. The details of what happened in that room were never made public, as was the practice in communist Czechoslovakia, where executions were carried out in secret, and no information was released about the process or the condemned person's final moments. But standard protocol would have involved Marie being led into the execution chamber, stood on the trap door, the noose placed around her neck. It is not known whether she was hooded or blindfolded, whether she spoke any final words, whether she cried or prayed or faced death with stoic acceptance. The executioner would have gone into an adjoining room and pushed a lever toward the wall, releasing the trap door and dropping Marie into the void. Death by short drop hanging could take several minutes, the condemned person kicking and struggling as consciousness slowly faded. When it was over, when Marie Fikackova's body finally stopped moving and hung limp from the rope, she became part of history as one of only 2 women executed on those gallows. The other would be Olga Hepnerova, hanged in 1975 for driving a truck into a crowd of people and killing 8. In the years that followed, Marie Fikackova's case faded from public consciousness. The communist government, having executed the killer and closed the case, had no interest in ongoing discussions about inadequate hospital oversight or failures in the medical system that had allowed a murderous nurse to operate undetected for years. The case was mentioned occasionally in criminology texts and discussions of female serial killers, but it remained relatively obscure outside of Czechoslovakia. Then, in 2007, the case exploded back into public awareness when journalists began investigating the full scope of Marie's crimes. Some reporters labeled her as potentially the worst serial killer in Czech history, suggesting that her claimed total of 10 or more murders made her more prolific than any other known killer in the country. This characterization, though based largely on Marie's own unverified confessions, captured public imagination and transformed her from a footnote into a legend. The truth about how many Bobbies Marie Fikackova actually killed will likely never be known with certainty. The documentary evidence is insufficient. Too many years have passed. Too many potential victims were buried with death certificates listing natural causes or birth complications. What we know for certain is that she murdered at least 2 infants and seriously injured at least 3 others. What she claimed was that she killed at least 10 and hurt perhaps a dozen more. The discrepancy between these numbers represents a gap that cannot be bridged by available evidence. Some researchers have argued that the medical protocols of the time, which required autopsies for infant deaths, would have made it nearly impossible for Marie to have killed 10 babies without being detected earlier. They point out that infectious diseases like polio were being carefully tracked during this period, and that suspicious deaths would have triggered investigations. Others counter that hospital oversight was inadequate, that autopsies were sometimes perfunctory, that infant mortality was high enough that a few extra deaths might not have raised immediate red flags. The case raises profound questions about trust, vulnerability, and the systems we create to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Parents who brought their newborn babies to Sucious Hospital in the late 1950s believed they were placing their children in competent, caring hands. The nurses and doctors working there were supposed to be healers, professionals dedicated to preserving life. The idea that one of these trusted caregivers was actually a killer, that she was using her position of authority and access to commit murder, violated every expectation of how medical institutions should function. Marie Fikackova was what would later be called an angel of death, a healthcare worker who kills the patients in their care. This phenomenon, though rare, has occurred throughout history and across many countries. Jennine Jones in Texas, Beverly Allett in England, Kristen Gilbert in Massachusetts, and many others have used their medical knowledge and access to vulnerable patients to commit serial murder. The victims are often the most defenseless: infants, elderly patients, the severely ill or disabled, people who cannot fight back or report what is being done to them. What makes Marie's case particularly disturbing is the apparent randomness of her violence. Unlike some angels of death who claim they were mercy-killing, ending the suffering of terminal patients, Marie's victims were healthy newborns with their whole lives ahead of them. Unlike killers who are motivated by sexual gratification or financial gain, Marie seemed to derive nothing from the murders except temporary relief from the anger triggered by crying babies. If her own explanations are to be believed, she killed because she could not tolerate noise, because hormonal changes made her violent, because she harbored ethnic resentments against Czech children. None of these motives make logical sense in the way that even the most twisted criminal psychology usually does. There was no benefit to Marie from murdering the babies in her care. She gained no money, no power, no satisfaction beyond the momentary cessation of crying. She risked her career, her freedom, her life, all to silence sounds that any normal person would simply tune out or manage through ordinary coping mechanisms. The psychiatric evaluations that found her sane, but prone to rage and depression, suggest someone whose emotional regulation was profoundly impaired. Modern psychology might diagnose her with intermittent explosive disorder, a condition characterized by sudden episodes of extreme anger disproportionate to the situation. Her claims about menstrual cycles triggering violence point toward possible hormonal factors, though such claims are often overstated and not well supported by scientific evidence. The ethnic resentment she expressed, rooted in her family's experiences after World War II, suggests someone who carried deep wounds from childhood and who displaced that trauma onto helpless victims who bore no responsibility for what had been done to her family. The fact that she targeted babies, the most innocent and blameless creatures imaginable, makes psychological sense in a twisted way. She could not strike back at the people who had actually hurt her, could not punish the Czechs who had taken her family's home or the father who had filled her childhood with alcoholic rages. But she could hurt babies, and in doing so, she could feel powerful for a moment before the guilt and horror of what she had done came crashing back. In the decades since her execution, Marie Fikackova has been studied by criminologists, psychologists, and true crime enthusiasts trying to understand what created such a killer. Her case has been featured in books and articles, analyzed in academic papers, discussed in online forums devoted to serial killers and criminal psychology. The photographs that survive of her show a young woman with a serious expression, dark hair, eyes that reveal nothing of the violence she inflicted. In one particularly haunting set of photos taken by authorities, Marie is shown participating in a crime reenactment, demonstrating with a doll how she killed the Bobbies. She holds the doll with clinical detachment, showing the interrogators the exact placement of her thumbs, the amount of pressure applied, the technique she used to crack tiny skulls. These images, preserved in archives, offer a glimpse into the methodical nature of her crimes, the way she approached murder with the same systematic attention she might have applied to any nursing task. The hospital where she worked continued to operate after her arrest and execution, though whether significant reforms were implemented to prevent similar incidents remains unclear. The reality is that no system, no matter how well designed, can completely eliminate the risk of a malevolent individual gaining access to vulnerable populations. Healthcare institutions can improve oversight, implement better monitoring systems, create cultures where unusual deaths or injuries are immediately investigated rather than explained away. But ultimately, the safety of patients depends on the integrity and mental health of the people caring for them, and those qualities are difficult to measure or guarantee. Marie Fikackova passed through nursing school, worked for years in a hospital, was considered for promotion to head nurse, all while harboring violent impulses that would eventually manifest in murder. There were warning signs, the torn ear and broken arm and other injuries that should have raised questions, but these were dismissed as accidents by supervisors who had no framework for suspecting deliberate violence from a trusted colleague. The families of her confirmed victims, and of the many possible victims whose deaths were never conclusively linked to her, lived with grief and uncertainty. Parents who lost Bobbies at Sushi's hospital during Marie's tenure had to wonder whether their child's death was natural or whether it was murder, whether the explanations they had been given about polio or birth complications were true or whether they were lies designed to cover up a killing. That uncertainty, that inability to ever know for certain what happened to their children, was its own form of torture. Some families learned years later, when the case was publicized again in 2007, that their child might have been one of Marie's victims. Imagine receiving that information decades after you had buried your baby and tried to move on with your life, suddenly being told that the death you had accepted as tragic but natural might have been murder. The psychological impact of such revelations cannot be overstated. Marie Fikackova died on April 13, 1961, strangled by a rope in a prison execution chamber, paying with her life for the lives she had taken. She was 24 years old, the same age as many young people today who are just beginning their careers, just starting to build adult lives, full of potential and possibility. But Marie's potential had curdled into something monstrous. Her intelligence and education turned toward destruction rather than healing. Her hands that should have saved lives used to crush skulls and break bones. The question of whether executing her was justice or simply additional violence is one that each person must answer according to their own conscience and beliefs about punishment and redemption. What is certain is that her death did not erase what she had done, did not bring back the Bobbies she killed, did not heal the trauma she inflicted on families and on the community that trusted her. Her legacy, if it can be called that, is a warning about the importance of vigilance in healthcare settings, about the need to investigate suspicious patterns of death or injury even when they occur in trusted institutions, about the reality that monsters sometimes wear the uniforms of healers and hide behind professional credentials. It is also a reminder of how childhood trauma, untreated mental illness, and societal prejudices can combine to create killers, how the wounds inflicted by war and ethnic hatred can echo through generations, manifesting in ways that seem incomprehensible to those who have not lived through such experiences. Marie's father filled her childhood with alcoholism and rage and ethnic hatred. Her community ostracized her family after the war, treating them as enemies and taking their property. She grew up feeling despised and powerless, and when she gained power over the most helpless beings imaginable, she used that power to hurt them. This is not to excuse what Marie Fikackova did, not to suggest that her crimes were somehow inevitable or understandable. Nothing justifies the murder of innocent bobbies. No amount of childhood trauma or social ostracism makes it acceptable to press your thumbs into an infant's skull until the bone cracks and the brain ruptures. She made choices, acted on impulses she could have resisted, continued killing even after she knew what she was capable of. She deserves to be remembered as a killer, as someone who violated every principle of medical ethics and human decency. But she also deserves to be understood as a human being whose life trajectory was shaped by forces beyond her control, who might have turned out differently if she had grown up in a loving family, received mental health treatment, lived in a society that valued reconciliation over revenge. The bobbies she killed deserve to live, to grow up, to experience all the joys and sorrows that life offers. Their deaths were tragedies that cannot be undone or explained away or rationalized. And that is the final horror of Marie Fikackova's story, that it ended not with understanding or resolution, but with death upon death upon death, with families destroyed and a young woman hanged, and a community left to wonder how such evil could have flourished in their midst, hidden behind a nurse's uniform and a professional smile, waiting for the sound of crying bobbies to trigger the next act of violence.